So I'm Keshav, and I work on the product marketing side of Swagger and SwaggerHub. And today we'll just be diving into headfirst on like what really is the OpenAPI specification. So we're going to be starting off with understanding, giving a quick overview of the OpenAPI specification, like what is, and specifically OpenAPI OAS 3.0. We'll be talking more about what's new in OAS 3.0, and we did a webinar about last month, which went more into details on like what were the new features. This is just going to be a quick overview of the new of just the highlights of the new features, and then finally, of course, we are going to be going in and doing a live demo on SwaggerHub, like when we're going to be taking an idea of what an API is supposed to be and then designing it from scratch using OAS 3.0. And of course, um, we'll always have time for Q&A. Oops, there we go. So really, let's look, if you have to think about why the OpenAPI specification exists, we'll need to start thinking about an API first. So an API is just a set of protocols that allows different applications or logical units to communicate, right? So think of it as a pure refined channel of data exchange that gets exchanged between systems. The receiving unit is usually a client, which then puts out a request. And then, of course, there's going to be a response which comes in from the server when the client hits the server with the specific request. Now, an API traditionally is sort of like a black box, at least before an interface was defined using Swagger or the OpenAPI specification, right? It was just like a set of protocols that was also built by a very that actually goes through a life cycle of different personas. So you have the architects who go about from a top level overview understanding how the API is supposed to behave and function. You'll have the developers and the testers who are making sure that the API works correctly, works as intended. They're also writing business logic against different resources. And of course, you have the technical writers who actually have to document this API to make sure that the end consumers of this API know what this API does. Now, however, in the traditional sense, when people actually approached API development without using a RESTful interface or like a design per se, there were some major problems that they encountered. The first one, of course, is that maintaining documentation, tests, and implementation was hard, right? Because because APIs are just like any other product, they do go through updates. They do go through an agile iteration of new features, new updates, new bug fixes. And then you have because we have such a diverse set of teams who are working on these APIs, so maintaining all of their different units together was incredibly hard. And because there was no real defined design on how the API should look and feel and behave, implementation was sort of all over the place, and it always came at the cost of the end user's experience. So, because there was such a need to like push the API out really quickly, and because there was no planned approach like actually building an API, the end user, the end consumer of the API suffered. And finally, of course, communication between different services built in different programming languages was not always easy, right? So for example, if you have a service that's built in Ruby and I have a service that's built in Node.js, we shouldn't be imposing restrictions on each other saying, I can only consume your service if I, say, get a Ruby SDK from you or like, a Node SDK from you, right? It has to be seamless. There has to be a common framework. And that really is what happened in 2010 when a company called Wordnik decided to solve this, was actually creating a RESTful interface, sort of like the equivalent of SOAP in SOAP called Whistle. And what this interface does is it not just doesn't just act as a common framework for all of these different teams working together to like build the API, so acting like, say, a template or a blueprint for your API, but also it sort of acts as an interface of sorts for your API. So think like sort of like not a GUI per se, but really an interface. Your API is no longer a black box. There's actually a RESTful interface that allows your clients to actually interact with the data or the service you want to expose. And this is the Swagger specification, this RESTful interface. Now it's called the OpenAPI specification. It was formerly called the Swagger specification, and this is a human and machine readable API interface purely for REST-based services that allows humans to implement API code that allows consumers of the API to read and generate API documentation as well as test cases against various API resources. And also because it's both human and machine readable, it acts as an interface of sorts, not just for your internal systems, but also for your teams to work together. So the OpenAPI specification is now the industry standard in how RESTful APIs are supposed to be defined. And so it's governed by the OpenAPI initiative, and this is an open this is a collaborative project under the Linux Foundation, and you have all of these different companies working together, as well as like the open source community in general, and all of them are working together to like standardize the way RESTful APIs are built and designed. So while the OpenAPI initiative supports the specification, there's always this question of what is Swagger now? Well, Swagger is and will always be the set of tools that's built around the implementation of the OpenAPI specification. So you have the Swagger editor, Swagger UI, the Swagger code gen, we have Swagger core, and we have a bunch of different other open source projects which you can find under the Swagger GitHub repository. And all of them are essentially helping accelerate the implementation of the OpenAPI specification. So Swagger are the set of tools that are built around the implementation of the OpenAPI specification. So really quickly, high level, what's new is we have some great features. There's improved reusability, parameter changes, there's improved examples, as well as support for content negotiation. And this is exactly what we will be covering in today's demo. There are some additional advanced features like support for describing callbacks. There's also a lot of questions on security. We will not be covering this in today's demo. And also, of course, links between different operations. We will not be covering these three sections in today's demo, but we do have plans to like go into more detail in the upcoming webinars. So I just want to quickly walk through some of the specification restructures. And so this was how the OpenAPI 2.0 was, right? So this is Swagger 2.0. You had if you just look at it from a high level in terms of like the structure, there was a lot of complexity to it, right? There's like structural changes in a bit to simplify the way you visualize how the OpenAPI spec defines an API. The root level objects such as definitions have been modified to be more encapsulate, bigger sections. And the whole purpose of this restructure is to address the inconsistencies in behavior of root level definitions. It also extends the opportunities to reuse different reusable syntax across multiple operations. So there's also the addition of servers as well to the root level identity, and this replaces the host and base path. With 3.0, you can have multiple servers as well for different environments, and we will show you all of these in the demo. Of course, we have now we have the parameters as well. So apart from like the regular query and path parameters, which have carried forward from Swagger 2.0 to OpenAPI Spec 3.0, we also have the header parameter. We also have cookies as well. So OpenAPI lets you define headers, as in like header parameters, and also cookie headers. Multiple cookie parameters can be sent in the same header, and they can be separated by semicolon and space. And also, instead of a big change, there's no longer the body parameter from Swagger 2.0. So when you're defining a post operation, you don't use a body the body parameter. It's been replaced with the request body. And request body also allows you to send form data. And finally, of course, these parameters are reusable, and they can be specified as reusable components under the component section. And finally, of course, in this demo, we will be covering content negotiation. So, from Swagger 2.0, consumes and produces have been removed. There was like basic content negotiation, which was supported in 2.0, but OAS 3.0 takes it a step further. So you can define different media types in your various schemas, and you can specify what goes into these different media types. So there's also better file upload support. So things like defining different media types and files, or uploading an array of files is present in OAS 3.0, but this was not present in 2.0. You can also specify a range in responses. So standard HTTP codes from 200 to 500 can be specified as a range. So it's time for the demo. And the way I'd like to structure this demo is really taking a hypothetical scenario. So let's take, for example, that we're part of the Smartbear company, and we want to design an API that allows users to obtain information about the employees within the company, or also post information about a new employee into the company's database, right? So think of this as an HR API. Our team, because SwaggerHub, because we were going to be showcasing some of our collaborative features. You have the API designer, the API documentation team, and you also have an API development team. So this is our team. Our objective is to build this HR API. So from a planning perspective, let's assume that we have one resource called the employee resource, and we want to specifically show. One is, of course, define a get operation under this resource that allows users to. One is, of course, get the information of all the employees within this company as an array. And you can specify the page limit as well as the information limit using some of the query parameters. You can also get information about a specific employee from the company's HR database. So here we're going to be showing a path parameter to do so. And finally, of course, you can post information about a new employee, and so we will be showing you how to create a post operation using the response body object. And the way we're going to be doing this is using SwaggerHub. So SwaggerHub is the API design and documentation platform that's built for teams to drive consistency and discipline across their API development workflow. So we have specific features like allowing teams to standardize their API design across multiple teams, centralized collaboration on a secure cloud platform, and finally auto generation and hosting of interactive API documentation. So let's get started. So this here is SwaggerHub. So I'm right now in the SwaggerHub website or the app. I've logged in, so you can see my login information right over here. And what I'm going to be doing over here is, if you see my screen, there's like the left panel is the my.
Hey, sorry, folks. I see that we're seeing some people saying that they can't see Keshav's screen. We're going to just work to resolve this quickly.
Hey folks, I hope everyone can now see my screen. So yeah, so sorry about that. So this here is the SwaggerHub interface. So if you notice on the left-hand side, this is the left navigation panel, and this is where you can quickly access some of the APIs that you worked on. So for example, there's the My Hub section where you can go in and look at all of the APIs which either you've created, so you can see all of these APIs which you've created, or APIs which you've collaborated on. Right. So for example, here, Case92, this is an API which I created, but there's also, for example, APIs which I've collaborated on. So there's like the book API, there's the inventory API, all of these APIs which I've collaborated on. You can also search through all of the public APIs available on SwaggerHub. So this over here, for example, this is SwaggerHub allows you to host and make public APIs discoverable by not just your teams or your partners, but also to the rest of the world if needed. And so you can search for public APIs available. So we have the Uber API, we have Instagram, so a bunch of public APIs available on SwaggerHub. And finally, of course, you have the ability to define organizations within SwaggerHub. So for example, I have the Smartbear software organization, which I'm the owner of, and you can see all of the APIs which Smartbear software has built in the past. So these are the API definitions which you've created. And you can see and you can discover all of these APIs really quickly for the organizations which you belong to. So in our case, again, let's get back to what we wanted to do. Is we wanted to build a new HR API in OpenAPI Specification 3.0. So let's do that real quickly. So let's go to let's click on the plus symbol right over here, and then click on Create a New API. So we're going to be starting with OpenAPI Spec 3.0, and we will be starting with a blank template. So let's give this API a name. So I'm going to call this the HR API OAS 3.0. Just give a quick name. Version number 1.0.0. I'm going to give this API name a title. So I'm going to call this the Smartbear HR API. And then I'm going to give this a quick description here, and I'll modify this once we go into the editor. Within SwaggerHub, you have the ability to define privacy or visibility for an API. So for example, if you're creating an API for just consumption within your organizations, like an internal API, then you can set the visibility to private. You also have the ability to create a public API for like consumption from the rest of the world. So we always recommend that if you're starting an API from scratch, even if you want to eventually transition to a public model, like make sure that it's in your visibility is set to private, just because you don't want an API which is unstable to be accessed by the rest of the world. So in this case specifically, I'm going to set this to public so that, while I'm working on this, anyone, any of our viewers can come in and check this out. I'm going to set this to off, auto mock. The auto mocking feature is on our roadmap for OpenAPI Spec 3.0. So we're going to set this to off for now. And finally, of course, you can define the owner of this API. So by default, it's set to Smartbear Software. You can change the owner to your personal account as well. I'm going to keep this set to my organization. So now we're on the SwaggerHub editor, where you can actually now go in and start defining and building your RESTful interface for the HR API. So let's start by, again, so one of the things which I always like to do before I start defining my API is like, let's just lay out the metadata and some of the most important features for information for any API is like, apart from like the basic information, like the version number and like the overall high level description, we also, it's good practice to define the terms of service as well as the support contact and the license information for your API. So let's just do that right over here. So I'm going to define a better description. Just information of new employees. Right, so this is just a high-level description on what we want this API to do. Let's give this the terms of service. And in this case, I'm just gonna go ahead and put down the smartbear.com/terms of use. And then from here, I'm going to define the contact information. So name here is going to be me. So I can define a URL as well. So if I have a website, I can define that. Here, I'm just going to define smartbear.com as the website name. And finally, of course, I can specify an email as well. And here, I'm going to set my Smartbear email account. And you notice that as I'm typing, it's getting automatically visualized on the right. So you can see that all of the information I just put in has been visualized by SwaggerHub automatically. And every time, say, I put in an object or like any other syntax which is not compliant with the OpenAPI standards, it gives me an error with also like feedback on how to resolve it. I'm also going to put in some license information. This is just Smartbear license. And URL, in this case, I'm just gonna put in Smartbear. These URLs don't exist. License.com. So yeah, so this is just like some basic groundwork before you go ahead and define your API further. So one of the big features in the OpenAPI Spec 3.0 is the ability to actually define multiple servers, right? So in 2.0, you had the ability, you can only set like one host and base path or one server for your API. In 3.0, you actually have the ability to set multiple servers. So say, for example, you have the API definition that exists in different environments. You can actually define this as well. So let's actually do that. And servers goes into the root. URL. So you can define this instead of I can just use foo.com for now, and description This is the dev server for the API. And same thing, I'm going to define another server. And there you go. Click on save. So we're defining the OpenAPI specification in YAML. And YAML is very particular about indentation. So one of the recommendations is always make sure that the indentation is correct. And again, the OpenAPI standard, we recommend that YAML be the way in which you define an API just because it's more human readable than JSON. So now let's go ahead and start defining our first resource, which is the employees resource. And again, if you remember, we call our objective. Our objective is to allow users to get information about existing employees within the company's HR database. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to define my employees resource, right? And under this, I'm defining my first endpoint, my first method, which is the get method. So let's give a description for this get method. The more information you can give about the API, the better, because that's the whole purpose of the OpenAPI specification is apart from the RESTful interface, it's also making sure that it's also allowing your consumers to get rich information about how to consume your API. HR database, right? And if you recall, one of our, we also want to make sure that we have the right parameters. So let's define two query parameters, one which allows your end consumer to define how many employees they want returned, and then the second one which allows users to define how many pages they want this information to be returned in. So let's define parameters. I'm going to give my first parameter a name. I'm going to call this body limit. This is going to be a query parameter, so I'm going to define this as a query. This is defined with the in object. It's, again, give it as many descriptions as possible. So return. And then finally, one of the big differences as well when you're defining APIs from 2.0 to 3.0 is the usage of the schema object. So there's a common, and you'll see this pattern as we design this API further, you'll see the schema object being referenced a lot. So we're gonna, which essentially allows you to define what specifically like this specific parameter is. So here, I'll show you exactly what I mean. So under the schema object, you will be defining things like what type of parameter it is. You'll also define, say, things like the minimum. So let's say the minimum here is going to be 10. The maximum employees we want returned with any specific API call is 20. And we can also define an example. So let's say example is 15, right? So this is, and again, we're getting the, an error right now because we haven't defined our responses yet. Just save this real quick. So we defined our first query parameter, which is the body limit query, parameter, and which defines how many employees you want returned. Let's define our second parameter, and I'm just going to copy paste this real quick. And let's call this page limit. And here we want to say the pages. Employee, oops, info, right? And let's just say over here that the maximum pages we want returned at any given point is 5, the minimum is 1, and an example of this is 2. Right, so we've defined two parameters. Some issues in. Yep, there you go. So we've defined two query parameters. So now let's go ahead and start defining our responses. So in this specific response, I want to define a 200 response. And in this 200 response, I want to, in my response body, which is going to be an array of employees, I want to give the ID, the employee name, and the employee title. So let's go ahead and define our responses. And again, the responses should be in the same level as the parameters. So make sure you're on the same level there. And with the SwaggerHub editor, you can actually see which line it is with the lines over here. So hopefully you guys can see my screen. Responses, right? So let's define our 200 response. And this is, again, standard HTTP error codes or status codes. Description. And now let's define what are the objects the array of objects you're going to get returned. So this is where the content negotiation part of the OpenAPI spec comes in, and I'll show you what I mean. So you can actually, instead of defining directly the body of the responses, you actually you start with the content. So the type of media, or the type of content you're going to be receiving. So in our case, let's say we want to define this in JSON, right? So application JSON. And under application JSON, again, we're going to be calling the schema. And if you recall, the schema, what the schema does is it defines the content a little more. So we're going to say this is an array, and the items you're going to be getting out of the array. And again, if you're defining an array, you have to follow that up with the items involved in the array. So let's define all the properties under this. And I'll describe everything which I'm doing again, just so that we can be sure of this. So just to recap what I'm doing right now, I'm defining the successful response, which is a 200 response. And I'm defining that the response is going to give back a JSON array. And in this JSON array, I want to say that you're on a successful call, consumers are going to be getting the ID of the employee, the name of the employee, and the title of the employee. So let's define that. So this is the first information. 1 second. So yeah, so we're defining the ID, which is an integer. Let's give an example of this, which is 4. Right, so I'm defining, again, my first endpoint, my first response object, which is the ID. And let's go in and define our second employee name. This is going to be a string again. And an example of this is, say, Ryan Pinkham. And finally, let's give employee title. Type of this is string. An example of this is market manager. Right. So what did I do over here? Well, let's recap real quick. So we defined our first resource, which is the employee's resource. Under this resource, we defined our first method, the get method. And again, what we want to do is we want to define parameters and responses, because that's what makes a basic API, the request and response cycles. So in the request cycles, we have 2 parameters. We have the query parameter, both of them being query parameters. The first parameter allows you to specify how many employees you want returned. And over here, the way we define it is one, of course, defining the name and what it is, which is the query. But also then, whenever you want to describe something in terms of like the type of parameter you're returning, or the type of object it is in general, and with examples, as well as some constraints, you use this the schema object over here. So we use schema, and under this, we define the type of some more details about the parameters in terms of like the data, what is the data structure, what type of data it is, what is the minimum and maximum, as well as with an example. Same exact logic for the second query parameter. And finally, when we go ahead and define our responses, we're defining our first successful response, which is 200. And then we have the introduction of a new object in OAS 3.0, which is content. And content, essentially, this is where the content negotiation aspect of it can come into the picture. You go in from, instead of defining the responses directly, you actually go in and define, first of all, the type of content you're going to be getting back. So here, for example, we would defining application/JSON to be the type of content. And under this, again, remember, schema is where you go ahead and define like the type of information you're going to be getting back. So we have the schema information over here. We're calling this an array. And under this, we have the various properties, which you use to then go ahead and define what that response object is. You can always this is just our first endpoint. And so let's go ahead and define, well, this is our first method. So let's go ahead and define our post method now. And of course, if you go over here, you can notice that whatever we just put in, this information has been rendered. Now, if you add more content over here, so if we have application JSON, we can actually go ahead and put application/XML. You'll actually see that being rendered. So I can actually do that real quick as well. We'll do that as we move forward. I'll show you an example when we go into the next phase of the design. So let's now go ahead and define our post operation. So again, be careful about the indentation as to where it is. So this is where I define our post and the method. And under post, I'm going to be, again, describing as much as I can. So So this is where, again, so this is a big change as well from 2.0 to 3.0. So when we were doing a post in 2.0, you had the body parameter. 3.0 has done away with the body parameters, and what we have now is something called request body. This just makes it much more easier to define objects, and they've also added, I believe, the file upload on the form data under the request body object. I know we have Ron on the call. If I say anything wrong, let me know, Ron, who's the developer evangelist for Swagger and OpenAPI. So we're going to be now defining all of our the parameter in which for the post parameter under the request body object. So we then need to specify that this is a required entity. So we say required true. Right, so because the post requires that you actually post something, so this is going to be true. And again, the same exact logic with the content negotiation part of it is you can now have to go in and define what is that content you want to push or like post to that specific resource. So over here, same thing. Let's define to be application /JSON. Let's define the schema, which is defining what the type of information you want to put. Now when we post, I don't want to post an array. I want to post specifically just one employee. So I'm going to post an object. So instead of array, I'm going to say this is an object. And now let's define all the information that goes in the post, right? So same, whatever we posted or whatever information we get back, we want to also post all of that. So. 1 second, my computer screen is stuck. Okay, sorry about that. Seems to be a little problem with my browser. Just give me a second. Yep, perfect. So we just defined what is the content which gets posted. And again, I just copy pasted all the information you get back in a specific, when you actually make a successful call. So the ID, the employee name, and the employee title. I'm only saying that when you're posting a new employee information, these are some of the things you need to have, which is the ID, the employee name, and the employee title. And of course, by default, every operation requires that you also have a response. So this response is in the same level as the parameters, or in this case, the request body, which is a parameter of sorts. Right? And under this, I'm going to be specifying our 200 response. So yeah, so this I put in a request, it's actually responses. Yep. So yeah, so we just defined our first a post method as well. So just a quick summary, this is a very simple API. Let me show the split view. As of now, what we did is we defined our first get operation under the employee resource. We defined the parameters that go, both of them are query parameters, and we defined what the successful response is when we actually get this information. And then we're also defining a post method under this resource where you can post information about a new employee in the system. So I'm defining the ID, the name of the employee, and the title of the employee. And the responses, which I am defining under this, is 200. Is just a basic successful response. In the real world, of course, we recommend defining as many whatever responses your API is supposed to get. So here in this example, I'm only defining 200 responses. Ideally, what you should be doing is defining even like the other responses, like the 400s or the 500s, which your API potentially gives. So let me save this. And now let's go in and define our next method, or sorry, our next resource, which is going to be a path parameter. Right? So here I want to say that I want to get information about a specific employee within the company. So here I'm going to define get. And let's see if everything is in terms of like the structure. Yep. Right. And over here, let's obtain information about specific employee. And over here, what I'm saying is now, if say, for example, someone puts in the ID in their request, if someone specifies the ID of an employee, they should be getting information about that about that specific employee from the API. So I'm going to be specifying for this a path parameter. The name of the parameter is called ID. Required, yes, path parameters like request bodies need to be set to true from a required perspective, because again, you need to specify this in order to get any sort of information. We have to define what the specific path parameter is, so that's where the schema comes in. So you define the type of this type of schema it is. You say specifically that this is the ID of the employee. Actually, we should say that over here. And then let's give an example as well. 54. Of course, you're going to be getting an error because you need to have responses as well. So let's say that on a successful response, you're only defining 200s in this example. Let's give a description of the success. And also, as always, define the content, right? And I'm going to be defining exactly all this specific information. Same exact content which we get content, right? So we define it to be application JSON, and then we define specifically the schema. There you go. So we just defined our path parameter over here, which is the employee/ID, which is where you actually can specify specifically which employee's information you want to get. And you put in your request, you put in the ID of the employee, and you will be getting, this is the ID of the employee, and you will be getting all of the if you see the example model over here, you'll be getting all of this information. So now I want to quickly touch upon, if you look at this API, you will notice that there's a lot of reusable components which we added. It's specifically all of the responses can be reused multiple times across the API. There's also specifically, if you look at the post method, under the post operation in the request body, you're essentially sending back the same information you might be getting back on a get operation, under the get operation. So what you can actually do is define the components section, where you can actually have all of this reusable components defined in a singular section that can be referenced across multiple operations or resources within the API. So I've saved this API. I'm going to actually create a new, add a new version to this API. So let's call this 2.0. Within SwaggerHub has an internal versioning system, so you can actually add multiple versions of the same API. And so I've added a new version. You can toggle between 1 and 2 at any given point. But I'm going to be making my edits to the new version to just like make it more, I would say, simple to understand and make sure all of the reusable components are defined in a singular section. So let's see what are the common things we can define. The first thing, as soon as based on what we just said, and as soon as you start looking at this API specification, one thing you'll notice is quickly you can actually define all of this, the information like the ID, the employee name, and the employee title, the response objects, as a common model, which is what we will be doing now. So let's go in, and under components, schemas. And so we're defining, this was in Swagger 2.0, this is called definitions. The definitions model has been done with, and it's been changed to components. And now under components, we have to define the schemas, right? So remember, schemas is what OAS uses to like define specifically the data type, the examples, and some information on like whatever the model is. So over here, I'm going to be defining a new model called employee, right? Description over here is going to be model containing employee info. And essentially what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be defining all of this information, right? So the properties and everything, this for an employee, I'm going to be defining that over here. Make sure this is in YAML, so make sure all of the indentations are right. And notice that as soon as I type this, it's been rendered on the right. So I've just defined my first employee model. And what I can do now is go in over here. And this is our first information. So let me go in right over here. And instead of having the properties, go in, put the $ref, the syntax for this. So if you do a $ref, sorry. Right? And now what we're doing is now instead of defining all of those objects in the operation itself, I'm going to be referencing the specific component. So it's going to be, this is the syntax. You're first going to be pointing to the specific API, which is done by the hash, and then it's going to go traverse to the component section, and under components there's schemas, right? And under schemas there's employee. Yep. So I'm now referencing this specific component over here, schemas. So now let's go over here and see where else we can reference this. There we go. We can also reference the specific component in the post method as well. So let's do that. So same exact syntax. So I'm just going to copy paste this. And again, we can see all of this information over here. And one of the things we can actually show off over here is also the content negotiation part of it. So now I can actually define application, say, /XML, and just copy paste the same exact. And if you go over here, you can actually select application XML, application JSON, and you can see how the response object would be, response body would be saying it's changing based on the type of responses you want back. So you can click on save. And you can do the same exact thing over here, is you can, in your post, is you can just change this to XML. Click on save. Right, so you can go into the post and you can select what type of response body you want. No, let's actually now go in, and if I look at the responses in my first operation, which is the get operation for an array, notice that this is actually asking for an array, right? And so what I can do actually is in my components itself, let's define a new section called employees. This is in plural. And this is where I can actually, I'm defining an array of employees, right? So in my description, you can call this an array of employee info, right? I'm going to define this to be type array. And then my items in this is going to essentially be all of the information under the employee model. So you can actually reference under components as well another component. So under my employees array, the plural, I'm actually referencing this specific, I'm saying all the items in that array is going to be having all of these properties, the ID, the employee name, and the employee title. So I'm going to be clicking on save. And now I can actually go in over here to my the first get method, right? And now in my responses, which is an array of information about the employees, I can actually just go in and under schema, instead of all of this information, all I do is type ref and slash components slash schemas slash employees. Second, it's right. So now we'll get all this. We're now referencing the specific employees, which is essentially an array of all of these, all of the information in the employee model. So this is where you can actually be very creative and make sure that your API is defined in the most simplistic of ways, but also in the way in which like all future definitions or all future iterations of this API can be done in a much more quicker fashion. So now when your other developers come in and add more updates to this API, or new endpoints, new methods, they don't have to constantly keep re-updating, adding new information. They can just keep referencing the components part of it. So the one thing, so this really is, so we've done a lot, and I know we're short of time. So, you know, we've gone from actually going in and defining, say, specific, we've defined two specific resources. One is, of course, the employees resource, where we go in and we've defined two set of parameters, both of which are query parameters. And we've shown you how you can actually go in and actually specify different information about these parameters under the schema section. And the schema section is, again, the same, how the OAS 3.0, what the OAS 3.0 uses to define information about any request or response body. Right, so we've done that. We've shown you how you can actually define the 200 response. Actually, let me show it. This is in 1.0. Right, so you can actually define the 200 response. Again, we also showed you the post method, and under the post method, we showed you a new object called request body, which is new to OAS 3.0, where you can define what you want to post. And finally, of course, we showed you the path parameter, which is how you can actually get information about a specific entity, and in this case, a specific employee. And then finally, in our version 2.0 of this API, we actually made this API a little smaller, a little more elegant for future iterations by defining all of our common information under reusable sections called components. You can also be more creative. For example, you can define your parameters as well under the component section. You can, and for referencing, you can also, for example, define your responses as well under components. But in this example, I'm keeping it short by just defining just these common models. The other big feature which I want to quickly touch upon is how in SwaggerHub you can actually take an existing API in 2.0 and convert that to 3.0. So I have over here, say, an existing HR API which is defined in 2.0, which is exactly essentially the same thing which I just showed, but in 2.0. You can actually go in over here, and if you click on the top right corner, you can actually convert this to OpenAPI 3.0. So SwaggerHub is one of the first tools to actually not just support OpenAPI Spec 3.0 in terms of designing and documentation, but also conversion. So once you click on conversion, you have this option to convert. So I'm going to click on convert and update. And you will see that all of this API is now converted to the OpenAPI Spec 3.0. And of course, you'll have to go in and potentially add a little more definitions or make it more concrete, like in terms of descriptions. But for the most part, this is our conversion was very seamless and works almost instantaneously. So that brings us to the end of our demo. I know we have about 10 more minutes for Q&A, 5 to 10 more minutes. But these are just the resources which you can use. One thing I do want to point out is that we have a very, very concrete documentation portal on Swagger.io, where we've documented not just the usage of the OpenAPI of the Swagger open source tooling, but also OpenAPI Spec 3.0. And this is, I think, the only comprehensive, one of the few only comprehensive documentations that exist for the OpenAPI Spec 3.0. So please do check it out. Shout out to our documentation team in Tula who've done a great job in documenting the OpenAPI Spec 3.0 as soon as it came out. But yeah, if you're interested in learning more, please feel free to use that resource. And SwaggerHub, we're always there. We have our resources. We have an active blog where we continue to support the latest and greatest in technology. So hand it over to Ryan for questions.
Thanks so much. We did receive a ton of questions during today's webinar, and we did our best to get to as many of them as we could. If for anyone that we aren't able to cover here or didn't get to in chat, we will do our best to follow up with everyone to get your questions answered. One of the questions that did come through was someone who seems to be just getting started. They wanted to know whether we recommend starting with 3.0 or if it made sense to maybe start out with 2.0 and then move to 3.0. I think it should be probably a pretty straightforward answer, but I figured it was worth bringing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very subjective question. As of now, the 3.0 is great from it adds a lot of rich expressive powers for actually defining an API that makes it really great. But again, one thing is, of course, if you really want that concrete tooling as well, 2.0 has been an established framework which has a lot of tooling built around it, right? And so a lot of Swagger open source tooling as well, which has now transitioned into 3.0. So it really depends on which stage of the life cycle you're in. I would say that 3.0 is just great, it's to describe an API in probably the best expressive way possible. But again, if you're looking for more tooling to fully utilize the power of 3.0, then a lot of tools are still coming out to implement the OpenAPI Spec 3.0. So that's just my recommendation: defining the API, OpenAPI Spec 3.0. But if you also want to take this to the next level and harness some of the open source as well as commercial tooling out there to really take this to the next level, maybe hopefully we'll be seeing much more tooling to come out and support this more.
Thank you. And another question we had is, can you put different content types in one response that you're defining?
Yes, you can specify as application JSON, XML, even images, I believe, in different responses as well as request bodies. So yeah, you can definitely do that, which is what we also did this in the demo as well. So we defined application JSON. We also did define XML. So this is one of the new features which has been added to OpenAPI Spec 3.0.
Awesome. Another question we had is, can I define some object like a class and further use it as a reference? Is that
I know, is Ron on? Ron is on the line, so if I don't really know.
You may not be able to get to jump in on that one. We have to go back to that one. The other question we had was around mechanisms to verify that a OAS 3.0 specification is actually up to date. I know that's something that it'll validate within your spec, right?
Yes, yes. So with SwaggerHub automatically validates your API to make sure that it's compliant with the OpenAPI standards, right? So whether it's 3.0 or 2.0, you'll always get like that error validation. SwaggerHub is also we're actually actively working to like release our style validator as well, specifically for the OpenAPI spec 3.0. So within your organization, say for example, you have specific styles or guidelines which you want your API to follow, then or like your design to follow, then you can have that specified in our style guide as well, and that's something which we're actively working towards.
Awesome. And you did show this quickly at the end there, but someone was asking if they have 2.0 specs, what's the best way of kind of get started on converting those to 3.0. So I think if you're using SwaggerHub today, we do have the ability to do that, and you can convert your specification over. We did get a lot of questions as well about importing existing Swagger files into SwaggerHub. If you aren't using a platform like SwaggerHub and you're using a 2.0 spec, I mean, I think important things are using some of the takeaways from today's sessions, then maybe have to go back and reconfigure your existing Swagger definition. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the cool things about the conversion is now instead of like going line by line in your existing Swagger 2.0 specs and like converting each and every line or like seeing if it's compliant, especially if it's like a long API which has like over 500 lines, which is a lot of APIs in the ecosystem as of now. You don't have to do that manually. You can actually import that directly to SwaggerHub. So we have an import capability within SwaggerHub where you can just import an existing API, which is in 2.0, and then convert it to 3.0 using our conversion feature.
Awesome. We did get a lot of questions around different tooling that will have support for OAI 3.0. It is important to point out that, here as part of the Swagger team, we are actively involved in the development of the new spec and certainly focused on the tools, but we won't necessarily have insight into some of the other tools that might be out there that are beyond the initial Swagger tooling. If you do want to learn about the latest open source tools that support that, we do have some information on our swagger.io website. And there was a lot of specific questions around the Swagger Code Gen tool. I did check with the team, and they will be releasing the first release candidates before the end of October to get your feedback. And then I would expect you'll see that within SwaggerHub, hopefully by the end of this year. So let's see if we had a couple different questions. Yes, so we had one. There was a couple questions that are coming in, and folks are asking us to go back to some of their questions, so you may just need to put them in. We are just about up to time, but if you are asking us to revisit your question, I'm sorry if I did miss them. We will do our best to get back to those. Let's see if we have time for a couple more. Someone was asking around support of the use of the links section for documentation. I know you touched on links a little bit, but maybe you could talk from a documentation standpoint, the use of those in 3.0.
Yeah, definitely. So that's one of the things I highlighted initially is that's something we're planning on like taking a deep dive in our upcoming webinars. Linking is something which, it's a very touchy topic because, it's not directly hypermedia, but it also helps in some high level way. So that's something we definitely want to touch upon in our upcoming webinars. In this webinar, we didn't want to touch on it just because it felt like a more advanced topic. But if you're very interested in like learning about linking, please do go to swagger.io/docs. You'll see the specification documentation, and right there on the left, you'll see the link section, where you can learn more about how links work in OAS 3.0.
Okay. And someone was just asking, it looks like this is their first time seeing the SwaggerHub platform, so maybe we can close on this question. And I know we're still seeing questions come through, so we are trying to pick them out the best we can, and we will do our best to answer these questions in a follow-up blog post or maybe a video or even another webinar. So thank you for everyone who's been putting your questions. But someone was asking specifically, why did we show SwaggerHub? Maybe they're usually using the Swagger tooling today. I mean, why would they want to use SwaggerHub over some of the Swagger editor? A lot of people using the editor, the UI, and even CodeGen today.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the open source tools are great for like doing specific job functions. Like for example, the Swagger editor is like really great for like going about designing concrete, awesome APIs, both in OAS 3.0 as well as Swagger 2.0. You have the Swagger UI, which is a section, which is another tool to like generate documentation. You have the CodeGen to like generate code. And then of course you'll have to go in and build your own infrastructure to like host all of this documentation, as well as provide the right access control specifically to different APIs, based on whether it's a private model or a partner model or even an internal model or a public model. What SwaggerHub does is essentially takes the best of all of these open source tools, adds another layer of features, as well as removes all of this infrastructural complexity of hosting and generation of code as well as documentation, and essentially allows you to go from planning all the way to documentation as well as generating code in the quickest and easiest way possible. The icing on the cake is collaboration. So we know that APIs, especially APIs, APIs, building APIs is a collaborative process. As we mentioned before, like it goes from architects, developers, testers, DevOps, documentation writers, there are different job functions, and all of these people have to work together to like build a great API, and it starts from the API's design. And so SwaggerHub offers a very collaborative tool to essentially allow you to deploy and deliver great APIs in the quickest way possible, while also ensuring quality in your APIs by standardization of design across your various APIs or your teams. So that really is in a nutshell what's the power of SwaggerHub, apart from all of the regular like bringing together the open source tools as well as auto generating and hosting the documentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are a little over time here, guys, so we are going to have to wrap up. I do still see questions coming in from Ronan, William, Peter. Sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions. There were some questions that came in that we do need some more time to meet with the team to get some insight on, so we will do our best to answer all of those. We appreciate you taking time out of your schedule today. Do feel free to send any feedback on today's session or any other further questions, and as I said, we'll do our best to get back to it. I'd like to thank Keisha for the great introduction to OAS 3.0, and thanks again for everyone who tuned in, and best of luck building APIs with the new spec. So.